Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. It's a beautiful Saturday, and we're all going to be able to head outside after we're done here and do some gardening. My name is Margaret McNeil. I'm a member of the Daffodil Society of Minnesota, and I'm going to be talking with you today about daffodils and some of the other what we call minor bulbs that you plant in the fall and get spring bloom. Tell you a little bit about myself. I've been growing daffodils for about 30 years. I've been competitively showing them at shows in Bachman's for about 20 years. And I love gardening, but most of all, I love what we call yellow fever daffodils. So we're going to talk first about some of the other minor bulbs, and then we're going to talk about daffodils. One instruction, use the chat feature in Zoom to pose any questions, and then we'll hold all the questions until the end, and then our moderator will bring up the questions and pose them to me. So hopefully you're familiar with the chat feature on Zoom and you can pose your questions. So we'll begin. Fall planting of daffodils and all the bulbs are going to bring you spring bloom. So next screen. Next screen, okay. Just some examples of blooms. So in the fall, think spring, and plant those bulbs. Now's the time. Don't hesitate. Next. Because we know that winter is going to come soon enough. And next. But even then, we get a reality check sometimes, and we've already got things blooming and pansies out, and then boom, we get one of those late snowfalls. Next. So, for early spring bloom, and I mean early, like in March, including this last spring, I had things blooming in March. We have things like snowdrops, specie and hybrid Dutch crocuses, little bitty dwarf iris, squill or scilla, and one you may not have heard of called Pushkinia. Another one, Glory of the Snow, and then grape hyacinths and specie tulips. And I'll confess that I'm not going to talk about the bigger hybrid tulips. I frankly don't know a lot about them and I don't plant them because the critters consume them the second I plant them. They eat the bulbs, they eat the flowers, so I don't plant the big tulips. I love them, they're gorgeous, but I'm not going to be talking much about those today. Next. So first, snowdrops, as the name suggests, they bloom as soon as the snow melts. Often I'll find if I've got a big pile of snow, when it finally melts, the snowdrops are already up underneath it. And in most cases already have buds. And they will open even as the top photo shows. They'll open right in the middle of the, on a sunny day, even though there's still snow on the ground. So snowdrops are really the first thing that's going to bloom for you in most cases. And they will form big clumps. So you can spread them around in your garden. Even if you only start with a dozen of them, you're going to end up with lots. Next. And then specie crocuses are sometimes called snow crocuses. These will bloom earlier than the larger Dutch hybrids, and they come in many colors. So one of the nice things about them, one of the things I find fun about them is that they'll open wide on a sunny day and close back up on a cloudy day, and they just keep opening and closing and opening and closing. And I just think that's kind of fun. Specie crocuses have some fun contrasting centers. The critters will nibble on them. Squirrels and bunnies will nibble on them. So I sometimes will just spread blood meal around, that powdered blood meal. And that will deter them, but they're worth it. So specie crocuses are usually about the next thing to bloom. Next. And then one that you may or may not have planted before, Dutch iris, or the dwarf iris. These are little bitty. They're maybe 3-4 inches tall at most. They're fun. They often are in yellow, the Iris danfortii, or the next, Iris reticulata. Usually the reticulata, the purples and blues, are the ones that I find in the stores most often, but the yellow ones are fun. I like them because I can see them from a longer distance. So I like the bright colors. Next. One you may or may not have heard of is Pushkinia, or striped squill. This is nice and short. Again, early, you can see in these pictures, there's a little purple crocus off on the left that's about to bloom. But the Pushkinia are great fun. They will spread like crazy. I probably planted a dozen of them originally, and they're now on both sides of my driveway, out into the lawn, and all over the place. But they are great fun and are again, some of that early bloom. Next. Similar to the Pushkinia are the Scilla siberica, or squill, the blues. One of the true blue colors in a garden, as opposed to the purplish, they will also spread all over the place. The nice thing about the Pushkinia and the squill, and the next one we're going to look at called Kyanidoxa, is that when they spread, even if they spill out into your lawn, to me, who cares if they spread out into the lawn? The foliage will have long since died down before you're doing any mowing. And they just, they bring you some of that wonderful early bloom, and make it fun. Next. So the Scilla will spread. They go to seed. I probably planted a dozen on this slope, and you can see that they have spread all over the place. Next. The Kyanidoxa, which is on the right. So you've got the Siberian squill on the left, the Scilla, and the Kyanidoxa on the right. They have intermingled, and the Kyanidoxa is a little more purplish, white and purple. So it's just a different flower type, but blooms at the same time. And again, just spills all over the place, gives you that early spring bloom long before your neighbors have ever even think about having anything blooming. Then next, come along the gray hyacinths, or muscari. They put up foliage in the fall, so don't be surprised at that. But they bloom in the spring. So the foliage, yes, it gets a bit ratty because it's there all winter. It's gotten severely damaged by the cold, but every year I've got tons of foliage of the gray hyacinths in my garden right now. It'll be really ratty come spring. Then it puts up just more foliage and the blooms, and they're blooming along with the daffodils. So they're a little later. I've been kind of doing this in chronological order. So the muscari, or the gray hyacinths, will come along. Most of the time you'll find them in blue or purplish, but they also do come in white. Next. Then there's specie tulips. These are generally, for me at least, these are generally more hardy than the hybrid tulips. They have wonderful contrasting centers. Similar to the crocus, they will open and close depending on if it's a sunny day or not. I have some specie tulips that have survived for 20 years. They don't seem to be quite as attractive to the critters. That's not universally true, but I have much more success with them than I do with the big hybrid tulips, which critters just devour for me. Next. So once spring is well along, bring on the daffodils. This last spring, we had a nice long spring. It was early. I had some daffodils blooming by mid to late April, but often if it's one of our more shorter, more condensed springs, compacted springs, it might be early May before the daffodils are blooming. Next. So daffodil versus narcissus versus jonquil. Daffodil is the same as narcissus. They are synonymous terms. Narcissus is simply the scientific term. Daffodil is the common term for anything in the genus Narcissus. A jonquil is one type of daffodil. And these, we'll talk about jonquils a little later. You'll sometimes, particularly in the southern part of the United States, you'll hear all daffodils referred to as jonquils. They just use that term. But in reality, jonquils are one type of daffodil, which grow very well in Minnesota, but they are just one type. Next. Okay. Some of the basics about daffodils. Almost all of them are hardy in Minnesota. There are some specific that aren't, and we'll talk about. There are thousands of cultivars. There are 13 divisions of daffodils that reflect the shapes and genetics, and jonquils are one of those divisions. They come from very tiny, even smaller than 3 inches, up to easily 16 inches. And if you've chosen carefully, you can get 4 to 6 weeks of bloom from them. To some degree, that depends on the spring. This last spring, we had a nice long spring. I did get 4 to 6 weeks of bloom from my different daffodil cultivars. But some years, as you know, our springs are so compacted that everything can happen in 3 weeks, which is always, I always feel cheated when that happens. But most importantly, probably, the critters will not eat daffodils. They won't dig them up in most cases. I'll talk about that. But they won't eat them, not the deer, not the rabbits, not the squirrels. There's a chemical in daffodils that makes them, it's not poisonous, but it's distasteful. And they might take a little nibble and that's it. The only critter I have that will go after a daffodil sometimes is a slug, which always, it'll just take a bite out of one of the petals and it's like, what? Come on, slugs, go away. So that's one of the best things about daffodils is that the critters won't eat them. I will say right here, a squirrel every once in a while will dig up a newly planted bulb. You put them in, the next morning you come out and there's a bulb lying on top of the ground. It's like, thanks, squirrel. What I think is happening is that the squirrel senses that it's freshly dug dirt and it thinks, ooh, there's a nut down there. I didn't plant it, but I'm going to go get it. All you do in that case is just the soil is all freshly dug up, just stick the bulb back in and cover it up. What I do to try to prevent that, some people I've heard put chicken wire down, totally unnecessary as far as I'm concerned. What I do when I plant bulbs is I simply really compress the soil, pat it down firmly so it's less obvious that it's freshly dug. and put down some mulch again, kind of press that down so that it's not as obvious that it's freshly dug. Next. So let's talk about the 13 divisions and why you care about those divisions. And this is where the handout that Bachman sent to you in advance of this webinar, this is where this comes in. You should have a 2-page handout. On one side is the comments about the growing daffodils that the Daffodil Society of Minnesota recommends. The other side are little drawings and descriptions of the 13 daffodils. And then I have handwritten on that comments about the summer growing conditions when the daffodils are dormant. So hopefully you have this in front of you so you can take some notes. But that's why you care about the 13 different divisions. Okay, next. The first division are what we call the trumpet daffodils. They are, what makes them trumpets is that this, as the name implies, the snout comes out way longer than if you were to gently fold a petal up against the cup. You'll find that the trumpet comes out longer than the petal does. There are miniature trumpets, there are big ones, there are medium-sized ones, but the key is in the summer, they're going to be happiest in a hot, sunny, dry location. Maybe not as dry as this summer was, but that's going to be their preference. Okay, division 2, what we call the large cup daffodils. They also prefer the hot, sunny, dry locations. And there are probably more cultivars of division 2 daffodils than there are any others. There are lots and lots and lots of choices of large cup daffodils. Division 3 are what we call the small cup. And of course, there are very specific measurements within the American Daffodil Society and the Royal Horticulture Society about what qualifies as a large cup versus a small cup. But for your purposes, the good thing about division 3 are that they are good mixed in perennial beds that may get some additional water. You might have them at the edge of a garden that is getting watered for other reasons. Might have a tree in it or a shrub that needs water. And so the division 3 daffodils are really good in that kind of an environment. Obviously, all of them are going to get whatever Mother Nature happens to give them, but it's the supplemental water that you want to be aware of. Division 4 daffodils are what we call the doubles. Some people love these and some people are not so fond of them. I happen to love them. They like hot, sunny, dry locations also for their summer period. So that's the doubles. Division 5 have 2 or more flowers on a stem, and the petals are kind of swept back. Some of you may have heard of an older variety called Thalia. That's a division 5. They are sometimes nicely fragrant, not overwhelming, but they can be very nice. They like it dry in the summer, but they wouldn't mind a little summer shade, though I have some in the bright sun that gets no shade, and they seem to do okay too. But the division 5 are fun because that's the first of the groups where you can get 2 or more flowers on one stem. Okay, the division 6 have 1 flower on a stem. They often are a little shorter, so they're good at the front of a border. The petals can be quite swept back, some of them very acutely, and the flowers is at a pretty acute angle on the stem. But one of the things I like about them is they're good for the front of a border. They like dry in the summer, but again, wouldn't mind a little cooling shade, and they can handle some summer watering that you might be doing. There's a particular variety that I haven't been at Bachman's in the last week or so, and I know they've got all their bulbs in now, but I'm hoping they've got one called Jetfire that is yellow and orange, and it's a terrific performer in Minnesota gardens. Great at the front of a border. I have a ton of it planted right along the driveway, so it's the first thing I see when I come home. So if I'm hoping Bachman's has Jetfire, but it's usually readily available. But that's a great Division 6, but a lot of them are really wonderful in Minnesota. Okay, Division 7, the jonquils. So we talked about the fact that some people call all daffodils jonquils, but jonquils are one particular division, 1 to 5 flowers on a stem. The petals are spreading or somewhat swept back. The flowers are usually fragrant. Again, not an overwhelming fragrance, just a nice sweet fragrance. And I have a lot of luck with jonquils in my garden. I have very sandy, rocky soil, but I have friends who also grow a lot of them in clay soil. So jonquils are a real good variety to look for, or division to look for. They are also good mixed in perennial beds that may get some additional water in the summer. So Division 7 daffodils or jonquils are worth looking for. The Division 8s are not hardy in Minnesota. I'll just say that. Don't bother planting them. 3 to 8 stems, or 3 to 8, what am I saying? 3 to 20 flowers on a stout stem. They are also sweetly scented. Bachman's and other places definitely carry flowers that can be forced in the winter, commonly called paper whites. But paper whites are a Division 8 Tazetta. They have a knock your socks off fragrance. Some people love it. I love it, but other people hate it. But there are other Division 8s that Bachman's and others sell that are not quite as intense a fragrance. So use them for forcing in the winter. The forcing is easy. One of the nice things about Tazettas is that they don't require a cold period. You don't have to refrigerate them or put them in the ground. I just stick them on top of rocks and water them, and this is what you get in the middle of the winter. So they're wonderful. Division 9s are what we call the poets. They have 1 flower on a stem, but the petals are bright, bright white. They almost glisten, sparkly. They're so white. They have a very small flat cup, and it's usually edged in red. And they are great in perennial beds that may get some additional water in the summer. They do tend to bloom later in the daffodil season. Late meaning mid to late May, as opposed to late April. But poets are fun for a later bloom in the daffodil season. We're going to skip over to Division 11, and these are what we call the split daffodils. These like the hot, sunny, dry locations in the summer. If we call them split, if you picture taking a daffodil with a razor blade slitting down the side of the cup and laying it back flat against the petals, that's what these daffodils are. Again, some people love them and some people hate them. I think they can be very interesting. And so the split cups are fun and worth looking for in the garden store. I'm sure Bachman's has some. Okay, Division 12s As with anything, these are the daffodils that don't fall into any other category. There's always a everything else category. You may walk into Bachman's in the middle of the winter, desperate for something that will remind you that spring will come, and you'll find these pots with these little bitty daffodils in them. Often those are tete-a-tete daffodils. They are one of the miniatures within Division 12. It's not always tete-a-tete, but that's often what it is. So Division 12s, I have some luck with growing in the garden, but boy, they are great when it comes to forcing. And so they're my February go-to when I can't stand winter any longer. And one thing I'll tell you, if you do buy those little pots, they are worth trying to plant out in the garden later in the summer or in the spring. So if you get one of those pots, keep watering it even after the blooms fade. Let the foliage die down naturally, and then you can just stick it someplace where it can just dry out. And either in the late spring or in the fall, plant those bulbs outside. Now, forcing bulbs is hard on them, so they probably won't bloom again for a year or two, but better than throwing them away, because you may be able to salvage those bulbs versus the paper whites. I should have said when we were back on the Tazetta bulbs. Those do not even attempt to plant. Not worth it. Throw them out. And I wouldn't put them in your compost pile. Better, they could have viruses and stuff, and better not to do that. So Division 12s are great fun. Okay. Division 10s and 13s I put together because neither of them is particularly hardy in Minnesota. Just not worth it. Division 10s are kind of strange looking, what we call hoop petticoat daffodils or bulbocodiums. Those little things sticking out around the cup are the petals. Pretty strange looking daffodil. Not worth growing in Minnesota. The same with the Division 13s, which are the species in wild forms. They're quite challenging, and I wouldn't bother with them. What you'll find when you walk into the garden store, take this chart with you. You probably have made some notes on it as to which ones might work best in your microclimate, in your yard. The way you'll find them described in the garden stores and in catalogs are, they won't use the division numbers normally. They won't say Division 1 versus Division 4, but they'll talk about trumpets, large cup, small cup, doubles, splits, those kinds of things. So those are the terms you're going to look for. And you can literally take that chart into the store with you and select bulbs that are most likely to work well in your microclimate. Okay. After the daffodils, some of the other minor bulbs that you might look for. I confess I don't know what the correct way to pronounce this. Sometimes I say kamasha and sometimes kamasha. I think it's kamasha. Likes a bit of shade. It's the purplish flowers in these two pictures. Comes in lots of different heights, and it tends to bloom, for me at least, about the same time that Pulmonaria does, as you can see in the lower left. So kamasha is a nice one for a little later in the season. And another group for later in the spring season are the alliums, the ornamental onions. Lots of different heights and colors and sizes. The lower left are allium molly, Molly, M-O-L-Y, quite short. more mounding, and bright yellow versus some of the other alliums that can be several feet tall and great big globes. So the alliums are great fun later in the spring season. Next. So I always get questions about companion plants. I talk about planting daffodils in with perennials or annuals. So some of the sun-loving perennials, daffodils like to be in as much sun as possible. So sun-loving perennials that don't require a lot of extra water in the summer. We know that some daffodils prefer hot, sunny, dry locations. So you want to plant them near the perennials that don't require a lot of extra water. So daylilies, the black-eyed Susans, the coneflowers, peonies, liatris, all of those are just examples. There certainly are others as well. I try to avoid ones that form a thick mat, like the irises, both the bearded and the Siberian iris. When I do plant them in with perennials, I have learned that daffodils seem to work best in front of those other perennials. That way, as the foliage is dying down, because you do want to let the foliage die down on its own, your eye is beginning to get drawn to something else. It's getting drawn to the peony that's starting to bloom, or the daylily that's budding. So you want to have, you want the eye to be drawn to those, and hopefully it will ignore the dying down daffodil foliage. Next. And also annuals. This is a garden on the side of my driveway. Again, I'm looking for sun lovers that don't need extra water in the summer. Obviously, an annual that you're just putting in the late spring is going to need water to get established. And that's fine, because the daffodils are still active underground at that point too. But things like zinnias, these are the shorter, I think it's profusion zinnias, alyssum, marigolds, snapdragons do great with them. And then one that you may or may not be familiar with, but if you want to attract pollinators, try Verbena bonariensis. I got it originally as seed from a catalog. And once you have it, you will never have to plant it again. It will go to seed all over the place. You will have hundreds of baby verbena, many of which you will pull out. But the Verbena bonariensis is those little purple, they tend to be on a stem that'll be maybe 18 inches tall, 2 feet tall. But in this picture, they're the little wispy purple. The butterflies love them. The bees love them. All of these are great pollinator attractors. But I particularly like to encourage people to look for Verbena bonariensis. Once you find it, you'll never have to plant it again. You just pull out the excess babies in the spring. But it's a great, great flower. It's in full bloom right now, has been since, I would say, mid-July. And the butterflies go nuts over it. So these are all good annuals. Okay. So select hardy bulbs from reliable sources. Bachman's is certainly a reliable source. Other garden centers generally are too. Plant them by mid-October at the latest in Minnesota. Pointy end up, 3 times, I should say, the fattest part of the bulb. So if it's the fattest part is an inch, inch and a half, about 3 times that height in terms of depths. Do not pull apart the multi-nosed bulbs. The one on the right, they will split when they are ready. Do not pull them apart. Most important, water, 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 this fall and every fall. Daffodils have to grow roots and wake up, basically. They've been dormant for a couple of months in the summer. They have to wake up and grow their roots and go through some chemical changes in order to survive Minnesota winters. So this fall, when you plant them, and every fall subsequently, water your daffodils. Don't hesitate. I start in about mid-August. They're starting to wake up underground. You can't see it, but the roots are starting to grow if they get water. And if they don't, they are going to rot, and you will wonder why your daffodils didn't come up the next spring. So we are having a daffodil sale, a bulb sale, this coming weekend out at the Arboretum. So if you're have a chance to come out to the Arboretum, I don't want to take sales away from Bachman's, but I want to sell the bulbs that we have as well. They're all hardy in Minnesota. They were just grown here and in Western Wisconsin, and they are great. Next. While you're at it, if you haven't already, get the next generation or two involved. These are children that have participated in our show at Bachman's in past years, and they love their daffodils as well. So remember to water every fall. Enjoy your daffodils for years to come. Don't forget our bulb sale this coming weekend, and come to our daffodil show. We sure hope we will be having a daffodil show at Bachman's this coming spring. It's been several years now that we've had to cancel it, but we are really, really, really crossing our fingers. So a couple of websites. This is the website for the Daffodil Society of Minnesota, and an email address if you have questions about your daffodils. Also, the American Daffodil Society has an amazing website, daffodilusa.org, and a searchable photo one. You buy bulbs, you get home, you don't remember what it looked like. Go to daffseek.org, put in the name, and you can see photos of the flower to remind you, oh yeah, this one was the one I really liked. I do suggest, if you're going to go from catalogs, it's a little late this year, but two of the reliable sources are Brent and Becky's bulbs and McClure and Zimmerman's bulbs. They are both catalogs that are reliable in terms of for the general gardener. They're not specialty bulbs, but they're good ones. And of course, your local garden store, particularly Bachman's, always has a wonderful selection of bulbs. So, are there any questions? And Karen, I thank you for running those slides.
Of course, yes, you can hear my voice now. We
Yes.
do have a question, Margaret. Thank you so much for that great information. Someone was wondering if they could plant bulbs in containers rather than in the ground, and how they might go about that.
The problem with, I'm picturing by that question a large container for perhaps that's going to be outside all winter. If that's the case, I would say no. It's going to freeze too solid. There won't be enough protection to be able to have those bulbs survive. Another option is forcing bulbs, which there's some information on our website, the Daffodil Society of Minnesota's website about forcing, and I think Bachman's probably has a sheet about forcing daffodils or forcing bulbs. And those require refrigeration, perhaps a refrigerator, a spare refrigerator in the basement or whatever. There are all sorts of tricks to make that work. But a large container that's going to be outside all winter is not likely to succeed.
Okay.
In our climate.
Yep. Very good. Another person asked, would you please speak to planting? How deep, how close together, fertilizer, yes or no, and how many to put together for a nice sustainable clump?
Okay, well, some of those I tried to address on the other side of the handout that we sent. So there is some information there as well. But the depth generally is going to be about 3 times the height of the fat part of a bulb. I tend to go down about 6 inches, also loosening the soil below it so the roots can easily get down into the soil. If you're going to air, we have learned that air slightly on the shallower, not real shallow, but maybe 5 inches instead of 6. Our understanding is that daffodils are among the plants that the roots will pull the bulb down to its desired height, or excuse me, depth, but roots can't push it up if you've got them too deep. I usually go about the depth of a trowel and a little longer or a little deeper, roughly 6 inches. Fertilizer, the key on that, we don't generally recommend fertilizing in the bulb or in the hole with the daffodil bulb. If you do put some in, make sure that it is not touching the bulb itself. So you'd put in a little granular fertilizer, mix it into the soil, put just a smidge of soil on top of that, and then put the bulb in. If they touch, it contributes to something we call basal rot. The bottom of the bulb where the roots come out is the basal plate. And if it's touching fertilizer, it will tend to rot. So I don't put any fertilizer in when I'm planting. I'll put in a little compost, and that's it. If you are going to fertilize it later or in subsequent years, potassium, often sold as muriate of potash, is a good fertilizer. It encourages the root development, and that's really the most important thing in a daffodil. So I hope that got most of those questions.
That was multi-tiered question. And then it looks like we have one more. Will daffodils not come up or not do as well if planted in a part of the garden that gets sun in spring before the trees leaf out, but is somewhat shady in summer?
Okay, what we call seasonal shade. They should do pretty well. Obviously, daffodils love as much sun as they can possibly get. And they are growing, they're actively growing through mid to late June. From that time on, shade is okay. But the more sun they can get while their leaves are maturing and feeding the bulb for the next year, the better. So with seasonal shade, probably the bigger issue is, where is the shade producer? Meaning, if it's a large tree and the bulb is getting root competition, the tree is sucking up all the moisture in the spring and the fall when daffodils want moisture. That's probably a bigger issue than the shade itself. So you might find that they last several years, but they might slowly peter out. So the more sun, the better. As my trees personally have gotten larger and larger and larger, I have moved the daffodils that were remaining out of those areas because they just didn't get enough sustained sun. So.
Great, thank you. And then one just came in. What is your favorite method of planting? They're seeing a lot of gardeners online using augers.
If you're doing a lot of bulbs, augers are fabulous. A big long drill bit on an electric drill. We did planting at an area recently as a group. a couple years ago, and one of our members had an auger, and it was fabulous. It does a lot of work for you. I don't personally use it in my garden. I just use a trowel or a shovel. And that's good enough. But if you're doing a lot of bulbs, augers are well worth it if you can find somebody with a powerful drill and an electric source and a big drill bit. They're great. Just be careful of the depth that you go. And we haven't talked about mulching really, but sometimes if you're doing a community area, there's a tendency to put down a ton of wood chips or whatever. Don't go too deep. 2 inches is 2 inches is probably good, but we were involved in one a number of years ago that 5-6 inches of mulch went down on top of what we'd done, and virtually no daffodils survived because they couldn't get up through all that mulch that had compacted over the winter. So be careful about that if you're doing a large community kind of project.
Perfect. Thank you. And then how many bulbs are needed in one area for a nice presentation?
I'm going to assume that it's the same or similar cultivar with comparable bloom time. We often recommend something that we would, well, technically bulbs should be planted 5-6 inches apart. I often do closer together, particularly if what you want is the next spring, you want a good display. I would put them closer together. It does mean that if they're happy and they multiply over the years, you'll have to divide them sooner. If you don't want to divide them, put them 5-6 inches apart, and that'll give plenty of room for babies to produce, etc. We sometimes recommend, when we're selling bags of bulbs out at the Arboretum, something we call the dinner plate method, because we have big bulbs of the same cultivar as well as a number of babies, all the same cultivar. And so we put the bigger ones around the outside of the size of the dinner plate and the babies in the middle to give them some room to grow. So that's one option. But otherwise, I would say 5 to 6 apart if you're looking for a longer term, closer together if you're looking for a more immediate impact.
Super. Well, Margaret, that looks like that's all the questions that we have. So we will wrap it up.
Okay. The key is get to your garden store now and plant by mid-October, and then water, 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 water. A lot of you are living in areas with water restrictions, but every other day watering, whatever water when you're planting, keep watering, and every day or every year in the future, don't forget to water them. But thank you for joining us. Now you can go change into your gardening clothes and get out and enjoy this beautiful day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.